Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Taking Control of Conflict, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by Dr. Annette Cremo. My name is Sarah and I'll moderate today's webinar. The webinar will be about an hour, and if you have any questions, you can go ahead and type them into that chat box. We'll be answering these questions as they come in live at the end of the presentation or in an email if we do run out of time. Annette is a seasoned training professional with over 15 years of experience in education, organization development, and human resources. Welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Yes, well, welcome and thank you. I'm looking forward to doing this webinar because conflict is sort of something that I get so many questions about how do I deal with conflict. We see people with different styles. So today we're going to go over how we can take control of conflict, maximize the time that we have with the other person to solve the problems, and how to handle some of those workplace disputes that sometimes get into. All right, our course objectives today, we're going to look at different strategies for handling conflict. Now we all have a preferred way of dealing with conflict. Maybe it's not the optimum way for dealing with a certain conflict, but we're going to look at the different strategies and know when to use the strategy. You're going to understand characteristics and drawbacks of each style of those or strategies that there are, recognize the sources of conflict and those that occur in the workplace, implement strategies for effectively resolving conflict. So hopefully you'll have some strategies that you can walk away with to deal with it a little bit differently. Practice some behaviors to minimize tension and conflict. I think if you understand what you can do, you can minimize it. But also I suggest go out and practice it when you're in a conflict situation or you see it happening. See if you can apply some of these things and then proactively address issues before they escalate into problems. Sometimes if we let things go, it just gets in the pot, it stinks worse. All right, so here's our first chat-in. I want you to think about a conflict that you were involved in or you know about or you observed, either directly or indirectly at work, that resulted in a negative outcome, hurt feelings, lost productivity, negative environment, damaged relationships. I quit my job. I don't want to work with that person. You could just chat in and maybe write your answer or write your comments down about that situation, and then I want to go over some of those. All right. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Bad attitudes is definitely one that people will, once the conflict is done negatively. People not coming to meetings, absolutely, because people get upset or they think the meeting's not, or maybe are afraid to bring up any kind of conflict in a meeting. Yeah, conflicts, and it's interesting to think why these conflicts are dealt with in such a negative way. We're going to go over some of that one. Let's look at the next chat in. Hold on. All right, now think of a conflict that you were involved directly or indirectly that resulted in a positive outcome where things sort of got better after that conflict. Yes, definitely. I see somebody said that the conflict was that it had a positive outcome because even when you have a situation and we know how to deal with it, it makes it much better. So we know the person that we're dealing with, we can explore some innovative solutions for everything, and it does improve those relationships. All right. So why do you think, another chat in, why do you think one conflict resulted in a negative outcome and the other one in a positive outcome? Take a minute and you want to chat in, please. Yeah, I think one thing that I'm seeing coming through is that the individuals that have to do with it had a lot to do with, is it going to be positive or is it going to be negative, and how they dealt with it. Because conflict itself is not good or bad. Conflict, it's the way we deal with it that makes it negative or positive. So let's look at some of these things. What's your approach to conflict? Well, if you look at some of the research that's out there, there's a predominant model that looks at conflict, and it was developed by two psychologists, Blake and Mouton, in 1964, and it looks at how managers dealt with conflict. So it's a managerial grid, and they looked at it in 5 different ways. Once in the conflict in the workplace, you can either are very forcing, my way or the highway, you can withdraw, you can smooth, compromise or you can be a problem solver. And to that, if you look at some of the other researchers out there, the Thomas Kilmann model of conflict, they have now, they looked at it in as you can compete, you can avoid, you can accommodate, you can compromise, or you can collaborate. And if you look at the conflict strategies inventory by HRDQ, they have the integrating, the compromising, the competing, the smoothing, and the avoiding. We're going to go over all of those as we continue with the presentation today. So I'm going to ask you now, our first poll is, how do you feel about conflict? Do you, A, avoid it at all costs? I tolerate it, but I don't like it. Conflict is not a problem for me, so you're okay with it. Or I like to stir the pot. So if you could answer that right now, how you feel about conflict. And then we will, oh, good. All right, Sarah, I think we got some good results here. All right, you want to close that one? Yeah, look at that. I tolerate it, although I do not like it. I think many people are like that. And I often wonder why you feel like that about conflict. Why do you don't like it? What makes people not like conflict? And as I do my classes in conflict, I look at how did you grow up in dealing with conflict? What lessons were we taught when we were young? So I think a lot of things come into play with it. Definitely one's our personality, but the other one is what lessons did we learn from our parents? What lessons did we learn from our teachers, from society? You know, were you the kind that you come home from school and maybe your son comes home from school and says, you know, mommy or daddy, somebody hit me on the bus or yelled at me on the bus, and you're going to say, okay, well, go back and deal with it yourself. Or you may be the type of person that came home and said, you know, they hurt me or they hit me or they said something bad, and you were told, now play nice, don't say anything. So it's sort of like, you know, smooth it over, don't do anything about it. And I think a lot of this is now translated into how we deal with conflict as adults in the workplace. But I think one thing I want you to remember, one important thing, is that conflict itself is neither bad or good. Conflict is neutral. Without conflict, there would be no changes. Without conflict, there'd be no progress. So conflict is not bad or good. Conflict just is. It is how we deal with conflict that makes it either bad, works out well, or does not work out well at all. All right, so this is the managerial grid that I referred to before. And on the vertical axis, you'll see concern for production or concern for the problem. And this is the same thing with the TKI, Thomas Kilmann. And on the bottom, the concern for people. So the higher the concern for people and the higher the concern for getting the problem solved, it sort of goes up into the upper right-hand corner of the problem solving, or somebody who is very collaborative. Let's sit down, let's talk about it. And then you have at the bottom where, you know, I don't really care about the problem, I can't impact it, and I really don't care about the people. Then you have withdrawing and getting away. And again, these are strategies that that you could use in when you have a conflict that you have to deal with. Now in this, if you look at we're going to go over some of the conflict styles, but we're going to go over the conflict styles as they relate to the conflict strategies inventory by HRDQ. And so those styles are the integrating, the compromising, the competing, the smoothing, and the avoiding. So if you are an avoider, you probably tend to remove yourself from any kind of existing conflict situation and steer clear of those on the horizon. I don't like it. I want to stay away from it. You may not like the tension that it creates, and sometimes you may have a tendency to undervalue your contributions, or you may not feel comfortable in speaking up in certain situations, and they would be your avoiders. If you're a smoother, and by the way, the avoiders, sometimes we do it with animals. The avoiders I put as my turtles. They just go in their shell. My smoothers are my teddy bears. If you prefer the smoothing strategy, you frequently like to put other people's goals or needs or requirements ahead of your own. You may gloss over the conflict in the interest of maintaining harmony in the relationship, in the team, in the organization. And sometimes you give up when there's a conflict, when maybe you shouldn't. So that's your smoother. My competing, and that would be the forcing on the grid that you see right there, is my sharks. they will win at all costs. They stand their ground. It's their way or the highway. They view conflict as a win-lose situation, and they want to be the winners. And they may thrive on the competition. They may actually like it. They are my pot stirrers that are out there. I saw some of you that are some pot stirrers. The compromising is really, it's right in the middle. It's splitting the difference. It's, I'll give up a little bit if you give up a little bit. So it's sort of give and take. And there are some pros and cons to that. I know maybe this is the style that I use with my kids sometimes. If you do this, I'll do that for you. I think one problem we have with that style, especially if you're a manager, or a supervisor, or I guess really anybody, is that people are going to wait until you give them something before they sort of back off a little bit in the conflict situation. And the last one, the problem solving, the integrating, or the, as Thomas and Kilman say, the collaborating, is a style that we believe that conflict is good. And I respect you. I want to hear what your opinions are. We have concern for all parties involved, and I think this is one that when we actually deal with conflict in this way, it's mutually beneficial to everybody and addresses everybody's goals. So that's just an overview of what each one of these styles are, but I want to go over more into what specifically what the characteristics are, what the pros and the cons are of them, and things you may want to do if you are one of these styles. So in the avoiding, the characteristic is low concern for people and production, or people and the problem. Sometimes leaves the issues unresolved, you ignore your own needs, and you have a horrible fear of conflict. You would rather run away than anything else. It can be a strategy when the issue is not worth having a conflict about or getting involved with, when you need to buy time. So it is a strategy. So I use this strategy when there is, I think, sometimes hot tempers or outbursts, and you just want to, you say, all right, let's take a time out. Let's get our heads together, and we'll come back and talk about it. So I think when you want to buy time is good. And then when you want to temporarily reduce that tension between the individuals. The strategy can potentially have some negative effects because conflicts may never get resolved. You could become complacent and demonstrate a lack of willingness to challenge policies, or you may get maybe a reputation for not caring about the conflict or the issues that are involved. And you could have some built-up resentment that could be released in the future. So if you're going to keep stuffing the conflict in and not saying anything and agreeing with it, it is going to bother you inside, and sometimes you're going to blow a gasket and you'd be out of control at that point. So you want to make sure that you use the strategy when it's appropriate, and if it's really something you need to air out, you got to do it. If you're stuck in the avoiding category, you want to just step back for a minute, think about reasons that I should resolve the conflict. What are some of the pros and the cons? Write down what you would like to see happen in the conflict, so you go in with all that information, knowing what you want to get out of it, and then meet with the other person. Don't be afraid to have that conversation with them. But I think before you go in to meet with them, it's really important that you do know what you would like to get out of it. All right, next one, and this is my teddy bear, the smoothing. Smoothing strategy is a low degree concern for the issue or the problem, but a high concern for the people that are involved. They yield to other people. They give up their own goals sometimes. They tend to be selfless. They gloss over a conflict to maintain harmony at all costs. And they're always, I think, they're giving in to the other person and their demands or requests, and not sometimes having themselves heard as they should be. It could be effective when you want to create goodwill, when you're trying to keep the peace, when you want to develop rapport, show reasonableness, or the issue is not important, but the relationship is more important. And I see smoothing happen, from what my clients are telling me, more in a personal relationship. So the more you have a relationship with the person that you are dealing with, the more likely you are to be a smoother. So we see this happening a lot with your partner, perhaps. The strategy can have some negative effects. You can have some built-up resentment of feelings for the other person. Your needs and goals are not met at all times, and others may get the impression that you're easily persuaded, or you could they can, I don't know, put one over on you. So you don't want to be like that. All right, so if you're stuck here in a rut, here are some strategies that you can use for that. Rate the importance of the issue. Take the people out of it and think about the issue itself and how important is it to you in getting the issue resolved. And in smoothing to, as we see with some personalities, sometimes we have to learn to say no. You have to practice that. All right, my sharks here, the competing, the characteristics are they're very forcing. It's a low concern for people, and I want to get the conflict resolved, my way or the highway. I disregard what other people say, what they think, what their needs are. I'd like to argue and debate. I like to stir that pot. I become firmly entrenched in the issue, not seeing anybody else's side of the issues. And I use my influence to direct the outcome. I desire a win. It's always win-lose for this one. It could be effective when there's an emergency. When you're in a conflict that has to have a quick decision, best to use this style. Or you want to protect your self-interest or your core values. So there's many different types of conflicts. You have a conflict against, it could be ideas, it could be information, it could be processes, it could be your values. And I think the values type of a conflict is probably the most difficult one to resolve because it has to do with things that you sort of were socialized and you grew up with and is in your heart of heart. So many conflicts are easier to resolve than the one on values. All right, so the competing strategy can potentially have these negative effects. It could undermine relationships. It could cause resentment. It could destroy the trust in a relationship, trust in a team. Others don't want to work with you. They will avoid you because they'll know how you are in dealing with that conflict situation. And I have some of my, when I do the trainings, people will tell me that sometimes they fear this person because they know they're going to blow up and they don't want to listen. So you sort of put people on the back burner when you have this style. So if you're in a rut, you might want to try these strategies. Before demanding your own way, stop and think. Put that big stop sign in front of in your head and say, what do I really want? What do I really need? And think about the other person. You have to learn to listen very carefully to what the other person is saying without jumping to conclusions. Remember, I think we did one on listening, and sometimes when we try to listen, we have so many things going on in our head about, oh, I know what the answer is going to be. I know what I'm going to say next. I know this person doesn't know what they're talking about. So you really have to silence all that talk inside your head and listen to what the other person says. Consciously allow the other person to have the last word in the conversation. Let go of your need to be right. And think about what outcome would be best in the long term. Don't simply go for short-term gains. Because I think it's important if you are going to have a good relationship with your partner, with your team, in the organization, that you want to be somebody that can come back and I can solve a problem with you, that I'm not afraid to talk to you. So compromising, again, the compromise is splitting the difference. It is sort of moderate on both categories of people and the task or the production. And you want to concede to a goal without satisfying. If you know what you want out of the conflict, in the compromise, you're going to split the difference there. It is sort of negotiating, and it's finding middle ground. It is, to me, a little win-win, where the competing was the I win, you lose. This is two small wins on the part of the people who are involved in that conflict. It can be used effectively when you and the other party are struggling to move forward, where you don't have time to reach a collaborative solution, but are committed to resolving that conflict and moving forward. And if you have equal power with the other person, that would be a good strategy to use. So it can have some negative effects. The person's, neither of your needs are fully met, not yours or the other person's. And so people go away from the conflict feeling dissatisfied, or they may think I wasn't heard, or I really didn't get what I wanted. And the issues, again, may need to be revisited because sometimes it's just sort of a Band-Aid for getting the conflict resolved. So if you're in a rut with this one, Allow dissension during discussions. Don't be afraid to hear people out. Examine all the potential solutions for the problem, for the conflict, before you actually decide on what you want to do. And strive to reach the best overall solution for everybody involved. And that will get you out of that rut. All right. So it is the integrating or the collaborative approach. The characteristics are you have a great concern for getting the issue done. You're going to get a lot of good ideas, brainstorming, creativity if you do this one. And you're going to find a mutually beneficial solution for everyone. You're going to be, people are actively listening to the other person when they are integrating or collaborating. They identify shared needs and shared values, so what they have in common, and they build on those commonalities, and they solve for the little differences that they have, but it's always more positive and forward-looking. And then it's great for engaging in positive and creative problem solving. Right? The strategy can be effective when the issue is can be an effective strategy when the issue is too important to compromise. I think when you need creativity, when you have to create something, a solution that is mutually beneficial, when you want to make sure that the other person is coming back and is not afraid to voice their opinion with you, or you want to preserve or strengthen your long-term relationship with the other party. I think that's really important. It can have some negative effects, though. It does involve a lot of time and energy, and people may become exhausting if it is used for every conflict, and every conflict does not need this type of a strategy. And as I was going over these, I was hoping that you're thinking about what kind of a conflict you would sort of use some of these strategies in. So, for example, if you have the competing strategy, I can see where there could be danger, or there could be a breach of policies in the organization where you have to assert your way and say, no, it must be done this way. So there's sort of a situation in the organization or in your relationship that you would use each one of these strategies. Right. It offers a long-term solution. It provides two types of satisfaction for the individuals that are involved in this conflict. First of all, it makes sure that other parties' goals and objectives are met, and the subjective party can have a positive feeling about the other one and how the conflict was handled. They feel good about the conflict resolution process, and the emotions they invest in the whole conflict resolution process, they feel as though they're worthwhile. But it does take a lot of time, and it takes practice, too, in how to resolve a conflict in this way. So, after we talked about all that, what do you think your conflict, here's our poll here, if you could vote, what is your conflict style? Okay, they're still coming in, almost, yep. People are still voting, so I'm going to keep it open just a little bit longer. All right, it looks like we have a good number. Sarah, do you want to show what it is? Look at this. All right, so 8% of those on the line here said they're avoiders of the conflict. Smoothers, a little bit more, 27%. 6% are competing. Interesting. I find when I do my sessions, I have a lot more competing than that. So we have how about the compromising, the integrating? Well, the compromising is splitting the difference, and the integrating of the collaboration is 19%. So you can see definitely we have a lot of compromisers in here. I think that's probably the easiest and quickest way to deal with the conflict. You know, you give in a little bit, the other person gives in a little bit, but as we said before, that may not always be the best way to do it, depending on what the conflict is. All right. Here we go. Sources of conflict. I think I mentioned this before as I was going through the slides. There are a conflict of your values. We have interpersonal conflict. I don't know, it's something within our heads, or we're talking, between I like this or I don't like that. What can I do? The interpersonal conflict, or interpersonal conflict with another person, conflict of goals, poor performance, power struggles, limited resources, organizations-based conflict, a conflict in perhaps way of doing things. So many different sources of conflict. And I bet you all deal with conflict from the time you get up in the morning. Now, if you look at the conflict of values, your core values, this is when you have a conflict when there's incompatibility of beliefs and principles that guide our behavior. These, to me, this is in your heart of hearts, and that's why I said this is probably the hardest one to get resolved. It usually can't be resolved through negotiation, reason, or persuasive arguments. And sometimes with a conflict of values, you have to just agree to disagree and let it go. Right. So how can you identify that you have a conflict of values with another person? You see people insulting someone's character or their beliefs, or negating the way they feel about something. If people don't understand reasoning, or they refuse to understand reasoning, maybe they could, but they refuse to do it. The behavior elicits intense reactions. There's a principle of matter. The principle of matter is more important than the situation itself. So they're sort of stuck on different things. But again, this is a really hard one to move past. So first of all, in doing this, in trying to move past a conflict of values, you want to make sure the other sources of conflict that are resolvable are uncovered. As I said before, you want to look at even some of the commonalities. But what can we work on, and what are things that we can't work on? So you want to sort of divide those up and make sure you work on the things that are possible. You want to honor and respect the other person's values. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. How does it feel to have that same value as the other person? Or if you have a strong value, what are some of the emotions that are going on in you? Walk in their shoes. Find other values that you agree on. And again, agree to disagree about specific values that separate you. Sometimes it's not worth fighting over. Interpersonal conflict, or conflict with the other person or within yourself, arises around communication preferences and work styles. And they usually are they're superficial differences with the other person, but these are the conflicts that I see that are not handled in organizations, whether it's in your team or with another person that you're working with. Sometimes these are the ones that are let go, and the ones that we bottle up inside, and all of a sudden we explode. These conflicts sometimes result in hard feelings at work, and I think as you said before, that people leave the organization. There is attitude problems, all of those things that we see in these interpersonal conflicts. Here's some identifying traits of an interpersonal conflict. We're frustrated with another person's annoying habits. I want to change the other person. Sound familiar? Emotions are out of balance with the conflict's importance. So sometimes I think if you look at how your brain processes the information, those of you who attended the emotional intelligence webinar, if you look at how your brain processes it, all the information goes through your brain, and if we can sort of calm the emotional center of our brain down, we can logically think through this conflict. But sometimes when our emotions get sort of triggered, that is when the conflict gets stuck in that emotional part, and instead of talking about the emotions or about the conflict itself, we will argue emotionally. So it says we're tempted to argue. And I see what happens in an organization, the gunny sacking is we sort of deal with it. Remember that one and in the compromise, sometimes we deal with it partly, but it's not really dealt with it. So we put it off the table, but we put it in our gunny sack. We put it in this bag, and we don't deal with it, but it sits there. And then another conflict comes up, again, dealt with it that way, shove it in that bag, and you get to a point sometimes that people will blow a gasket. And when they blow the gasket, what they do is they empty this bag of stinking conflict onto the table, and things are brought up from many, many years ago. I see this in relationships. I see this at work. It's like, let it go. But they can't because it was never resolved. So you have to make sure it's resolved before you can move on. In order to resolve that conflict, you really have to identify what it is and be able to state it. Because a conflict, for me, a conflict well stated is a conflict that's half solved, if I can say what it's about. And it will take me away from arguing emotionally. All right. So how to handle these conflicts? Understand people's work styles. Understand their personalities. Personality is another one of the, I think sometimes people get frustrated with each other because of their personalities and why can't they do things the way I do them. And we say they're not crazy, they're just not you. So we have to know the other person. Look at their work styles and how they deal with work, how they deal with, how they communicate, how they deal with that conflict. What's their conflict strategy? Are they that avoider or are they the confronter? So you have to know that. Sometimes these conflicts involve a lack of trust, and I think in any kind of relationship, whether it's a team that you're working with at work or in a personal relationship, trust is the basic element that will move us towards past that conflict. So, talk about some of Pat Lencioni's work. He says, if you look at the dysfunctions of the team, the base bottom dysfunction is trust. Without trust, we're not moving anywhere. And he says that once we are trusting of each other, we'll be able to deal with conflict because I will respect you, I'll listen to you, and you will listen to me. So I think that's important. And then do something to develop goodwill. Bring a cup of coffee, take somebody out to lunch, but something that will solidify that relationship a little bit better. All right. Now there's a conflict of goals. Two people fight over personal goals, ignoring the welfare of the team or the organizations. It has to be my way. No, it has to be my way. All right. That's another type of conflict. How to identify this kind of conflict? It involves concrete decisions and actions that you disagree with. Your approach would provide you, not the other person, with the best outcome. So it's all about me and what I want to do. And it can be resolved with rational problem solving. So how to handle this? Focus on the issue, not on the negative feelings. What is the issue? Describe that conflict. I think with any kind of conflict, I think if we can describe it, we're halfway there. Develop agreeable offers. Don't go for the first solution that you come up with. Look about all the solutions that you have. Brainstorm them. Put them out on the table and see, look at the pros and the cons of it. If the issue still hasn't been resolved, use rational problem solving. Listen to the other person. Look for underlying goals or interests. Eliminate the either-or thinking. Again, be more creative and listen well. And identify areas of interdependence and common goals, places where you need each other to meet your own personal goals. Go back to relationships. Poor performance is another cause of conflict. It affects not only maybe you as a manager, it affects everybody in your work team. Everybody who is trying to get their work done and maybe the poor performance is not dealt with right away. And this is probably, I was just doing some managerial training and did some 360s, and this was the number one thing that people were frustrated with is because they said their lead handled poor performance and it affected their job as well. All right, how to identify it? Poor performance could be they're working too slowly, they're making mistakes frequently, don't follow through on commitments, and they don't meet expectations. We really have to deal with this because it affects everybody. Poor performance I like to deal with in a way that is very sort of coaching-centric, where we want to have the attitude that I want to help the other person. I want to support the other person. I want to be able to ask them questions. I want them to be able to own their own behavior or own performance and help them understand. There are many reasons here behind poor performance as well, but I think one thing we have to make sure is that the other person decides as long as you tell the person what the expectations are, they will, and recognize their performance, their current performance, and have them come up with a solution for that poor performance. What can they do differently? And if it's their idea, they more than likely will follow through on it. I think that's really important. And always check back too. Just in good coaching, it's not just the coaching session and leaving them and say, okay, this is what they're going to do. Let them know you're going to check back with them. Say, I'm going to see how your solution worked out. Let's check back in a day or two to see how it was. I think with poor performance, one thing you want to make sure is that you deal with it as soon as possible. All right, another one is a power struggle. It results when people try to pressure or manipulate others to gain power or status in an organization. Here's some. I've seen this all. You probably have too in many of the organizations. Territorial behavior desire to be right, large egos, extreme need for control, pressure tactics, hoarding information. Yes, all power struggle. Again, if you want to deal with it, you have to have a relationship that's built on trust and mutual respect. Be honest and open with it. Build relationships in all directions with colleagues, management, frontline staff. Create networks based on common interests. And get to know the politically powerful in your organization, who they are and what they have power over. It's important. All right, now we have now a conflict over limited resources. It could be human resources, financial, technical, money, staffing, time allocations, supplies, equipment, space. All of those are for conflicts there. Establish an objective process for gathering data and identifying facts. Develop clear criteria for making decisions. Demonstrate transparency in how decisions are made and implemented, and consider the long-term consequences of decisions. I think in this one, too, it's important that we communicate what's happening. Sometimes the conflicts they will be dealt with behind closed doors, and it's frustrating for employees when they're sort of kept in the dark. And I think that causes conflict within the team, because if I as a manager do not share the information or maybe the solutions, or ask the people who I supervise for their input, they will get frustrated and shut down. It's not going to be helpful to you when you're trying to make any kind of changes. All right, then we have the organizations-based conflict. And these are maybe conflict about procedures or policies, lack of clarity about responsibilities and reporting relationships. For me, it says, you know what? No communication going on if there's an organization-based conflict like that. All right, you want to make sure that if there is conflict there, that are people informed about the policies? Are the policies written in a way that is understandable? Instead of just giving people the policies, do we also sit down and talk with them about them? I think as a manager or a leader in the organization, during your coaching session is a great time to talk about these policies and make sure that there's clear understanding about what they are. Make sure that they're posted, make sure they're available for people, have that discussion. Employee surveys. How do they feel about things? Are the policies working? Do they understand them? Get some information back from them. Look at some of the policies that don't make sense anymore. And I would imagine if you looked at some of your things in your organization that you wonder why these policies were in place over many, many years. And I have some examples. There's one example that I had that it's a story. It's not an example. It's about, the young woman who got married and she's making a roast for her husband, and she did the roast. She put all the spices just like her grandmother did, and she rubbed it in, and then before she put it in the pan, she cut the ends off and put it in the pan. And her little girl said to her, "Mommy, why are you doing that? Why are you cutting the ends off the roast?" She said, "That is the way Grandma did it. She made the best roast, and that's how she did it." And so the little girl went in and talked to her grandma and said, "Grandma, why did you do that? Why did you put all those spices on?" She said, "Oh, it made it taste real tasty." "And then after you did all that, why did you cut the ends off?" She said, "Oh, honey, it wouldn't fit in the pan." So many times people are used to doing things a certain way, and they don't look back at some of these policies or procedures or ways of doing things that don't make sense anymore. So we have to make sure we look at those. And lastly, communicate to make sure that everybody has a good understanding and they know the consequences of not adhering to the policies as well. So peeling the onion, the bigger the conflict, the more likely it is that multiple sources are involved. I think if you're going to do that, you have to make sure that you understand all of those sources that are there. So best practices for prevention of some strategies for prevention or minimizing a conflict at work. First of all, be a model for right behaviors. If you want a conflict to be dealt with, make sure that you know how to deal with that conflict and you deal with it in that way. People will look at you as a role model. Identify and address underlying tensions before things go wrong. Don't gunny sack it. Don't put it in the pressure cooker and put the lid on. Deal with it immediately. Provide clarity over what's expected from the other person, from your team, if you're a manager, from your employees. Manage toxic individuals who create conflict more firmly. I think one thing that is not taught that I don't see taught a lot is what is the conflict resolution process? And I think you owe it, if you're trainers, I think you owe it to the people that that you train to teach them the conflict resolution strategy. You know, first of all, what is identifying what the conflict is? As I said, a conflict well stated is a conflict half solved. Being able to verbalize what that conflict is. Sitting down with the other person and hearing what they have to say about the conflict. Looking for those commonalities that you have, things that you have in common, and little differences, so you can start building some of the bridges and having a creative way to deal with that conflict. And then just brainstorming ideas about what can we do to resolve this conflict. And then both of you agreeing on the best possible way that what you can do to resolve that conflict, and then going through with it. But I think it's important that we teach and we practice those conflict resolution strategies in class, so they're able to take them out. Because it's easy, I think, we hear things, we read things, and it's really easy to say, oh, yeah, I understand. But until you actually apply it or practice it, it's a little different. So I suggest you do that. Improve consultation and day-to-day management. Act as mediators when a conflict develops. If you know the conflict resolution process, sometimes you can bring two people together and you can make sure that one person is heard and then the other person is heard. So you're sort of like overseeing what the process is and helping them through this. And I think that helps. It helps to eliminate some of those emotional outbursts as well. And then not let the egos get in the way. Active listening. A technique that you want to make sure that you use in conflict resolution. Summarize content and emotions. If you see or feel an emotion, you may want to say about it, or you may want to observe it in the other person and bring it up. Verify understanding and offer opening for continued dialogue. You know, sometimes you may see a person get, just by their body language, they look as though they're getting tense or they're frustrated, or even, you know, they start understanding. Don't be afraid to bring that up to them. All right, in creating positive outcomes, address the issue without delay. Again, don't gunny sack it. Use neutral words. Use behavioral-based words. Avoid the you and finger pointing, blaming, bringing up things that happened in the past. Deal with the current conflict. Describe the positive outcome you want of that conflict. Embrace the differences of opinion. It's okay to be different. Again, a good conflict resolution strategy really is how people deal with the conflict, not the conflict itself. Focus on actionable solutions. Be detail-oriented and make sure you follow up to see if it's working or not. If feelings escalate, take a break. Use that one strategy. Remember the avoiding or my turtle? Yeah, take a break. Hold out an olive branch. Apologize without apologizing for your needs, and let the other person save face. But you just want to make sure that you take a break a little bit. Establish expectations, generally written down and applied to the entire organization. So they're the formal ones, and the informal ones are acceptable behaviors, and they may not be written down. But if you are, I think, on a team, this has to be discussed in your team meetings to say these are our expectations, or sort of our code of conduct. And once people know those, I think it's easier to hold people accountable for those. But they have to be stated. And then measure is the grievances and goals, both achieved and unachieved, in measuring how well you did with that conflict. All right. I am going to open it up for questions now. I think I saw some coming in. So, Sarah, I don't know if you want to read some of those questions.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much, Annette. And Annette's contact information is on that slide right there. So if you have any questions for her, go ahead, shoot her an email. And we do have a little bit of time for that Q&A, so attendees go ahead, submit those into that chat box. And while we wait for some of those questions to filter into me, we're actually running a 50% discount off of Taking Control of Conflict, and this is available in instructor-led classroom format or a self-study e-learning format. And you can go over to HRDQ-store.com for any more information or if you want to purchase. So let's go ahead and get right into questions. And the first question is coming from Anne. How do you handle conflict if you are a remote office?
That is a challenging one, only because much of the way we deal with conflict is we read a lot of it visually, and we look at the other person as we're dealing with it. I think the best thing you could do with conflict when it's remote is make sure there is good communication. If you have remote meetings, I always, at the end of the meeting, not only check for the content of the meeting, but I look at the process. You know, how do we work together today? What are the challenges that we have? The other thing that, even if you're remote, I think bringing people together time to time really helps them. I mean, once you shake another person's hand or once you have that interaction, it will really help you resolve that conflict. As long as you are a faceless entity, maybe on the other end of a phone, it's easier for me to be in conflict with you than when you become a real human being for me. So the more you can make that other person or make your team members get that humanness in there or that face-to-face, the easier it is going to be to resolve that conflict. But I would, you know, if you sense it, I would definitely bring it up in the meeting or to the other person. Don't wait for it. Don't gunny sack it.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Let's see, moving on. Our next question is coming from Mike. If someone in the workplace wants to do things their way and will not consider alternatives, is there anything that can be done?
Well, as you saw, that would be what style? That would be probably your competing style, right? My way or the highway. And some of the strategies we talked about there is, I think, first of all, I would put people through, everybody through a training session to teach them how to resolve conflict. As a trainer, I would make sure that at the end of the training there were some scenarios that address some of these issues and have people work through them and actually practice some of the skills in identifying it. You know, he may or she may want their own way, but do you have the courage to bring that up to them in a conflict situation? So I think that's the important part. Sometimes people don't know that they don't know some of these things. They don't realize they're doing something. It goes back to personalities. I think sometimes people are very overbearing. If you look at what's my style, that direct style, could be, they do have a tendency to be very, I'm going to say tunnel vision. Sometimes they are so intense on the issue, they don't intentionally want to offend other people, but sort of like their personality. And sometimes they just don't know they're doing it. So I would bring it up to the other person and see if you could deal with it in that way.
All right, great. Thanks. Let's see, moving on. Our next question is coming from Christine. If one has an ongoing conflict with a superior who may or may not be one's direct boss, what are some good ways for a subordinate to handle this?
Wow. There are two things. I mean, so it may or may not be your direct boss. I think if it is not your direct boss, you really need to talk to your boss about it and what's going on. You know, I think we saw it in the presentation today. There's many reasons for this sort of behavior. It could be the power, the ego, whatever that is, the person, or maybe the other person does not really realize they have a conflict. Some people are the pot stirrers, and they don't do it intentionally, but they do tend to cause conflict, but they don't realize it. So if it's not your direct boss, I would go to your boss and talk to them. If it is your direct boss, I think you have to, depending on your style, it sounds like you may not feel comfortable in working with and talking to the other person, dealing with that conflict, but they need to know. Without telling the other person that there's a conflict, it will never be solved. If I don't know that something's bugging you or that you don't like something, I can't deal with it unless I know. So I think you owe it to the other person to let them know what that conflict is.
All right, great, thanks. Moving on, next question. What do you do if an individual who continuously creates drama to the point that an entire team is impacted? Situations get to a point that explodes, conflict is addressed, and then it starts all over again.
Well, to me, and I don't know if you are a manager or not a manager, but I think that is the supervisor manager's responsibility to monitor that kind of behavior. And again, set ground rules. In the teams that I work with, the first thing that we do is to make sure that there are a set of operating guidelines that we're going to, that we can all agree to. what is sort of our behavior that is acceptable in the team and what's not acceptable. I think having that good conversation, first of all, and setting the baseline, say this is how we're going to act, is important, first of all. But then the behavior really needs, if it is that explosive behavior, really needs to be dealt with every time it happens, because it not only impacts you as the person, it impacts the entire team. And you're going to see teams sort of like they don't function well when there is that drama or that negativity in the workplace. So again, set the standards, and managers need to hold, I think it's sometimes very difficult to hold each other accountable. Ideally, that's the way to go, but if you can't do it, make sure the manager or supervisor is holding that person accountable for the behaviors that are agreed upon, and let that person know what the behaviors are.
All right, great, thanks.
Yep.
Let's see, next question is coming from Lauren. What is the best approach for a new supervisor with new staff to utilize to resolve conflict without really knowing the staff that well?
Now, can you read that one again, please?
What is the best approach for a new supervisor with new staff to utilize to resolve conflict without really knowing the staff that well?
Okay. I would, first of all, get to know the staff better through meetings. I love doing some of the personality styles. I think that's important. If you want to do the conflict styles, to do that and talk about it a little bit. But personality styles, get to know them as a team. Again, going back to Lencioni's work, what he says is you really have to get to know that the people who you are on the team with if you are going to start developing trust between them. So as a supervisor, I would sort of facilitate that process. So we build trust with the members on the team, and with that trust, we should be able to start having that conversation with the members. Some of the teams that I work with are always looking towards their manager to deal with that conflict, when ideally in organizations we should have the ability to work directly with the other person that we're having that conflict with. It's not always the manager or the supervisor's responsibility to do that. If the supervisor does see it, though, I would definitely say to address it as soon as possible, to, again, through coaching, to have her or him say, help me understand what's going on. I see this, I hear this, and it doesn't sort of make sense. Have people talk it out and see if you can pull out any kind of information or any underlying things that are going on. I think the other thing that's important, too, we pointed out in the webinar today, is develop things that you all have in common. You know, with any team, any organization, we should have a common goal. And if we keep that in mind, sometimes it's easier to resolve those conflicts. So if we both want the end result in a certain way, then we need to find out what we can do in order to achieve that. So I guess more information, communication, understanding people, and address it immediately.
All right, great, thanks. Let's see, next question is coming from Adrian. What if you're trying to resolve an issue and the person tells you they are just not interested?
Wow. You know what, so in conflict resolution, sometimes people they don't want to resolve it, and sometimes you have to let it go. You may want to, again, use the conflict resolution process to make sure you can verbalize what the conflict is in your mind without any accusations or use statements or putting the other person down, and then offer that person to let them know that, I'd like to hear your side. How do you feel about that? And see how they're feeling about it. Some things may bother you that do not bother another person, and vice versa too. But I think if you can sit down with the person and verbalize what's on your mind and then offer the other person to hear what's on their mind, sometimes they may not think it's a conflict, and it's your own personal conflict.
All right, wonderful. And I think we probably just have time for one more question. And
right.
This question is going to be coming from Blanche. How do you think stress or being under stress can affect which conflict style you use?
I think, remember we're talking about how emotions get involved in stress. In if you look at some of the books, and there's great books out there. I don't have the, if you email me, Blanche, I can get you the name of the books, but they're on neuroscience of the brain and how the brain works. And when you when you're under stress, your brain is in that fight or flight mode, which is a very emotional mode, and you tend to deal with your conflict more emotionally. And we all deal with those emotions differently. Some people will withdraw, and some people will be more aggressive with conflict. It may be that the style that you have is probably like times 10 or times 100 when you're under that stress. But it's kind of interesting, and that's what you want. You want to get the conflict out of the emotional part of the brain and get it to the logic part of the brain. And that's why sometimes we get stuck in there. And without being in that logic part, it's really hard to resolve that conflict because you're just going to be talking about emotions. And you're going to use a lot of you statements, and you're going to get frustrated. And, by the way, we don't listen as well when we're under stress. So, Blanche, if you want to email me, I can get you some of those books, the names.
All right. All right, perfect. Yep, and Annette's email is, let me just go back, right there. And, yeah, those were some wonderful questions. I know there are a ton of questions that we did not get to, but we're actually going to collect all those, put those into a Word doc, send those over to Annette, and then she's going to answer those, and then we'll probably get those out to you guys probably about, like, mid-next week. So, Annette, would you just like to add any final thoughts before I go ahead and wrap up then?
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for attending the webinar today. It's a subject that is really of interest to me because as I do training, two things I get asked for the most. Two topics are one on conflict and one on communication. And I guess sometimes we were never taught how to deal with or the conflict resolution process and realize that there is a strategy for dealing with conflict. And I think information is power. So I think this is hopefully give you some great information to try and resolve some of those conflicts in a very productive way. So thank you again.
All right, thanks so much, Annette. And unfortunately, that is all the time we do have for today. So everybody on the line, we appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative. Thanks.